Once upon a time, there was a king who didn't trust in swords or chariots. He trusted in God. But one morning, he woke up with a strange feeling in his chest, like a battle was marching toward him, and he couldn't even hear the drums yet. This is the story of how King Jehoshaphat learned that faith wins wars no army ever could. The wind was wrong. That's how it began. Jehoshaphat stood barefoot on the stone tiles of the rooftop garden, staring out at the endless horizon. The sky was painted with soft blue and gold, but something felt off. The birds weren't singing. The trees below weren't rustling. The air held its breath. Even the palace behind him was too quiet. It was the kind of morning that looks peaceful, but isn't. He gripped the edge of the stone railing. He didn't know why, but his heart was pounding. Then he heard it. Not a trumpet, not a scream, not even a word. Just one memory. Years earlier. He was 12, standing behind a curtain in his father Asa's war tent, trembling. Outside, swords clanged. Inside, his father paced. The general said, "They're outnumbered. We'll be crushed." Asa snapped back, "Not if God is with us." "Then pray faster," the general muttered, "because they'll be here by sunrise." Jehoshaphat had peeked through the flap of the tent, just in time to see his father kneel on the dirt floor and say 3 words, "You go first." He wasn't talking to a soldier. He was talking to God. Jehoshaphat jolted as a breeze finally stirred his cloak. He blinked. Was that thunder? Number too far away. Or maybe not thunder at all. Maybe something else was moving toward him. He turned and headed inside the palace, fast. He didn't need a scout to tell him what his spirit already knew. He could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. Not just a battle, a test. And this time, he wouldn't be hiding behind a curtain. This time, the people would be watching him. Upon a time, there was a king who didn't like war. But it came for him anyway. And when it did, he remembered something his father told him long ago. The strongest kings aren't the ones who swing swords. They're the ones who know when to kneel. This is the story of Jehoshaphat, the king who let God fight first. The sky was too quiet. Jehoshaphat sat alone on a hilltop outside Jerusalem, the cool grass tickling his ankles, his crown resting in the dirt beside him. He leaned back on his elbows, watching the clouds drift past like slow boats on a sea of blue. Somewhere below, servants were preparing supper. Scribes were probably rearranging scrolls. Guards were standing tall near the palace gates, pretending not to yawn. But the king, he didn't want noise today, just space, just silence. He reached down, picked up a smooth stone, and turned it over in his hand. The edges were soft, weathered, harmless. He tossed it into the air, caught it again, then sighed. Something's coming, he thought. I can feel it. He closed his eyes, and before he could stop himself, the memory came. Flashback. Years earlier. He was a boy again, barefoot, running through olive trees, laughing. His father, King Asa, stood nearby, polishing his sword under the golden light of the evening. "Jehoshaphat!" his father called. The boy skidded to a stop, dusty and grinning. "Come here." Jehoshaphat obeyed, sitting cross-legged in the grass beside his father. "See this sword?" Asa said, holding it out. Jehoshaphat nodded. "I fought 1,000 men with it. Some days I thought I was a hero. Other days," he looked out across the hills, "I just felt tired." Jehoshaphat tilted his head. "Then why keep fighting?" Asa smiled. "Because sometimes God calls us to fight." But more often, he set the sword down beside him. He calls us to trust. Jehoshaphat opened his eyes. The clouds had shifted, the breeze had slowed, and the ache in his chest, the one he hadn't wanted to name, was still there. He stood slowly, brushing grass off his robe, and looked down at the quiet kingdom below. God had been kind. There had been peace, no invasions, no betrayals. He had taught the people God's law, sent teachers across the countryside, turned the kingdom back to truth, but peace never lasts forever. Not here, not in this world. Jehoshaphat bent down, picked up his crown, and stared at it. The gold still shone, but today it felt heavier. He placed it gently on his head, not out of pride, out of purpose. And then, without a sound, he began walking back toward the palace, not to rally the army, but to fall on his knees. The sun was barely rising when Jehoshaphat walked into the temple courtyard, but word had already spread. 3 armies were coming: the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Edomites. Together they formed a force so large that no wall in Judah could hold them back. Servants rushed past. Priests whispered in corners. Guards asked each other what to do, but no one knew, except the king. Jehoshaphat stood before the people, his voice firm and clear. "We will not run. We will not pretend. We will not panic." A pause. Then he declared something no one expected. "We will fast." The courtyard fell silent. He raised his hand. Everyone, rich and poor, soldier and farmer, every tribe, every home, no food, no excuses, just prayer, starting now. People looked at each other, stunned. No swords, no war speech, no strategy. But the king's eyes burned with something stronger than fear. He turned toward the temple steps and climbed them slowly. Thousands began to gather, crowding the square, sitting on the ground, clutching their children's hands. And there, before the whole nation, Jehoshaphat raised both arms to heaven and said, "Lord God of our ancestors, you rule over every kingdom. You hold all power in your hand. No one can stand against you." The people listened, wide-eyed and breathless. "You gave us this land. We built you this temple. And now, this great army comes against us." His voice cracked just slightly. "We have no power to stop them. We don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you." No music played, no cheers followed, just silence. And in that silence, something stronger than fear settled over the people. Faith. Not loud, not flashy, but deep and growing. The people didn't leave. Not after the prayer, not after the fast began. They stayed. Some sat on the ground. Some stood with hands raised. Some whispered prayers beneath their breath. Children leaned against their mothers. Soldiers gripped their swords but didn't move. The silence was thick, but not empty. It felt like the whole nation was holding its breath, waiting. Then in the middle of the crowd, a man stepped forward. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a general. He was just a Levite named Jahaziel. No one had noticed him before. But when he opened his mouth, it was like thunder in a dry sky. "Listen, everyone, Judah, Jerusalem, even you, King Jehoshaphat." The people turned. The courtyard went still. "This is what the Lord says. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. This battle is not yours. It belongs to God." Jehoshaphat froze. The voice wasn't loud, but it shook something deep inside him. Jahaziel kept speaking. "March out tomorrow. Face your enemies, but you will not need to fight. Stand still. Watch. The Lord himself will save you." The words fell like fire on the crowd. They didn't shout. They didn't run. They dropped to their knees. First one, then another, then hundreds, then thousands. And in the middle of it all, Jehoshaphat fell to his face. Not because he was weak, because he believed. This wasn't just a rumor. This wasn't a strategy. This was a word from heaven. And when God speaks, the only thing left to do is worship. So they did. Right there on the stone floor, with no instruments, no armies, no answers. They worshiped. Because even though the enemies hadn't gone away yet, God had shown up first. The morning sun rose like a drumbeat, slow and steady, glowing red across the hills of Judah. But there were no war drums, no horses, no shouts, only silence and the shuffling of sandals. Jehoshaphat stood at the head of the army, armor gleaming but untouched, sword sheathed at his side. Around him were rows of soldiers, quiet, alert, ready. But they weren't in front. The singers were, dressed in white robes, no shields, no weapons, just harps, cymbals, and trembling hands. One of the younger ones leaned toward Jehoshaphat and whispered, "Are you sure this is how we start a battle?" Jehoshaphat didn't answer with a speech. He simply nodded. And the singers sang. "Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever." Beats. Their voices were shaky at first, thin, barely rising above the wind, but the farther they marched, the louder the song grew. Soldiers joined in, women hummed behind them, children clapped from the hills. Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever. Beats. It wasn't the kind of music you make to win a war. It was the kind you sing when you already know God's going ahead of you. The line of worshipers moved like a wave across the land, headed toward the wilderness of Tekoa, where the three enemy armies waited. Jehoshaphat kept his eyes forward, his feet steady. Every step was a risk, but every note was an act of faith. And then they reached the ridge. A soldier near the front raised a hand. "King, you'll want to see this." Jehoshaphat moved forward, slowly, carefully, and looked over the edge of the cliff into the valley below. His jaw dropped. Everywhere were bodies, weapons scattered, tents ripped, shields cracked, but no one standing. Not a single enemy left alive. No battle had been fought, no sword had been raised. The armies had turned on each other, confused, chaotic, violent, until no one remained. Jehoshaphat gripped the edge of a rock, stunned. They had done nothing but sing, and God had already handled everything. He stepped back from the ridge, heart pounding, eyes wide. His commanders looked to him, waiting for instructions. Jehoshaphat said just one thing: "Gather the people. We need to worship again." They called the place the Valley of Barakah, the Valley of Blessing, because they had marched into what looked like a massacre and found a miracle. And when the music rose again, this time it was louder, stronger, not sung in fear, but in awe. Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever. It took them 3 full days to gather it all. Gold coins, silver bracelets, iron swords never swung, silk garments still folded in tents that would never be used again. Jehoshaphat walked through the valley slowly, hands behind his back, eyes wide. The place that should have been soaked in fear was now overflowing with treasure. One general whispered, "It's more than we can carry." Another replied, "It's more than we deserve." But Jehoshaphat wasn't focused on the treasure. He looked at the faces of the people, exhausted but alive, singing, laughing, some still crying. He stopped in the center of the valley. "This is not a victory we won," he said. The people grew quiet, listening. "This is not a blessing we earned." He lifted his hand and pointed toward the hills. "This is a miracle only God could do." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jehoshaphat turned in a full circle, voice rising. "We don't leave this valley without thanking him." And right there, among broken swords and scattered tents, they built an altar. They sang again, not to get anything from God, but because he'd already given everything. They named the place Barakah, blessing. And when they finally marched home, they didn't carry shame or fear. They carried proof that faith was not a foolish gamble. It was the most powerful weapon they had. Later that night, Jehoshaphat stood on the palace balcony. Jerusalem glowed beneath him, lamps in windows, laughter in courtyards, a city safe once more. Behind him, a servant waited silently. "Tell the people," the king said, without turning, "tomorrow will be a day of rest." "Yes, your majesty." "And the day after that," he paused, "we rebuild." The servant blinked. "Rebuild, my king. We have peace now." Jehoshaphat turned slowly. "I'm not talking about walls," he said. "I'm talking about hearts." Because Jehoshaphat knew something most kings didn't. Sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't before the battle. It's after the victory. And the greatest enemy isn't outside the walls. It's inside the soul. Peace had returned to Judah. But peace, Jehoshaphat knew, could be deceptive. It didn't roar like war, it whispered. And those whispers could pull people to sleep. At first, things were good. The temple stayed full, families prayed together, judges took their work seriously. The people were still singing the songs from the valley, but slowly, cracks started forming. Little things. A merchant overcharging a poor widow, a scribe paid to lose a case. Rumors that idol worship had returned in secret to the border towns. And worst of all, people stopped listening, not loudly, not rudely, but in that polite, distracted way that said, "We're fine now, the danger's over." Jehoshaphat sat in council one morning, listening to a dispute over stolen grain. The judge fumbled. His answer was vague. The law was ignored. The king rose from his seat. "Enough," he said. The room froze. Jehoshaphat looked at the man in robes, the judge, straight in the eyes. "You do not judge for man, you judge for the Lord." He turned to the others. "So act like it. Judge carefully, speak truthfully, fear no man, but always fear God." A long silence followed. Then the council bowed their heads, because the king wasn't just protecting the land anymore, he was protecting the heart of the people. That week, he traveled from city to city, not to celebrate, to check foundations. In Hebron, he found a temple servant hiding carved idols in clay jars. In Lachish, he overheard men mocking the prophet's old words. In Beersheba, he listened as poor families begged for fair treatment. He didn't shout. He didn't boast. He corrected. He taught. He rebuilt, not with bricks, but with justice. One evening, As the sun set over the olive groves, Jehoshaphat walked the palace gardens alone. A servant approached quietly. "Your Majesty, the people are saying we've never been safer." Jehoshaphat looked up at the stars. "Safety's not the goal," he said. The servant tilted his head. "Then what is?" Jehoshaphat smiled softly. "Faithfulness, even when there's no war." Because the king understood something rare. Sometimes the real battle isn't on the battlefield. It's in what you do after the storm. The letter came by rider, elegant, polished, carried in a leather scroll case sealed with gold. Jehoshaphat held it in both hands as he stood on the balcony, the breeze tugging gently at his robe. The royal crest was unmistakable: King Ahaziah of Israel, Ahab's son, the boy of the northern kingdom, the son of the man who dragged Jehoshaphat into a battle that nearly killed him. The scroll read, "Brother, let us build together mighty ships to sail from Etzion-Geber. Let Judah and Israel prosper together." Jehoshaphat didn't respond, not right away. He tucked the letter into his robe and went for a long walk through the gardens. The past whispered in his mind. He remembered wearing royal robes on the battlefield while the real enemy hunted him like prey. He remembered crying out for God to save him when no one else could. He remembered surviving, barely, and now the son of that king wanted to partner. Later that day, Jehoshaphat called for his advisors. He unrolled the scroll and laid it on the table. "What do you think?" he asked. The men murmured. "It's a smart trade. It would open new ports. It would double our wealth. It's a risk, but a golden one." Jehoshaphat nodded slowly. "Yes, it sounds golden." Then he turned to the high priest. "And what does God say?" The priest answered gently, "The Lord has not changed, my king. He does not bless what begins in pride." Jehoshaphat stood up, scroll in hand, and walked toward the fire pit. He paused only once, then dropped the scroll into the flames. The parchment curled, the seal cracked, and the gold melted. The next morning, messengers were sent north with a simple reply: "Judah belongs to the Lord. We will not sail under any other name." There was no applause, no feast, just a deep stillness in the palace that felt like strength. Because Jehoshaphat had made a different choice this time. He didn't chase opportunity, he chased obedience. And as he looked out over his kingdom that morning, the breeze felt lighter somehow, as if even heaven was relieved. Days passed, then a week, then another. Jehoshaphat returned to his rhythm, listening to judges, walking through towns, praying with priests, checking in on widows and orphans. He wasn't chasing power anymore. He wasn't proving himself. He was just leading. And for the first time in a long time, it felt right. One morning, as the air still hung cool with dew, a messenger from the south arrived at the palace gates, his robe soaked in sweat, his eyes wide. Jehoshaphat was sitting beneath the courtyard portico, speaking quietly with a group of elders when the messenger dropped to one knee. "My king," he gasped, "the fleet has been destroyed." Jehoshaphat stood slowly. "What fleet?" The man looked up. "The ships of King Ahaziah, the ones built to sail from Etzion-Geber. A storm struck the harbor before they ever launched. Not one vessel remains." Jehoshaphat was silent, not surprised, not shaken, just quiet. The elders exchanged glances. "Your Majesty, one said softly. "If you had said yes." Jehoshaphat nodded. "We'd be rebuilding wreckage right now instead of watching the sun rise." That evening, the king walked the palace walls alone. He watched the wind ripple through the vineyards. The sky had turned golden. The city buzzed with peace. And all he could think was, God didn't just save us from war. He saved us from ourselves. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you for the no. Thank you for stopping me before I started something foolish. Thank you for protecting a nation through the decision of one man." Later that week, rumors floated in from the north. Ahaziah was furious. He had sent workers to repair the wreckage. He'd planned to try again, bigger ships, stronger sails, but they said a prophet came to him and declared, "The Lord is not in this. You can patch the boats, but you can't sail what God won't bless." Jehoshaphat heard it and nodded, because he knew now. Disaster doesn't always come with armies and swords. Sometimes it comes dressed as opportunity, and wisdom isn't always choosing what's safest. It's choosing what's right. That night, as the moon rose and the olive trees whispered in the dark, Jehoshaphat wrote a message in his own hand. "To the leaders who will come after me, don't measure strength by how many wars you win. Measure it by how many temptations you walk away from. Listen to God when it's quiet. He's always speaking." He sealed it, placed it in the temple archive, and slept soundly, knowing the kingdom was safe. Not because of swords, but because of surrender. The city was safe. The walls were strong. The storehouses full. For a while, Judah lived like a dream. No invaders, no famines, no fear. And slowly, something shifted. People got comfortable, too comfortable. They still came to the temple, but their prayers were shorter. They still sang, but only when they felt like it. Some spoke of returning to the good old ways, trading in discipline for convenience, conviction for control. They stopped remembering the battle God had won without them. They started thinking they were safe because they deserved it. Jehoshaphat saw it first during a royal tour in the hill towns. A judge let a bribe slip under the table. A priest rushed through a prayer like a chore. A family he had once seen singing in the valley of Berakah now bowed before a carved idol just outside their house. The king didn't shout. He didn't throw his staff. He just stood there, heart sinking. When he returned to Jerusalem, he called a council, but not of warriors, not of generals, of teachers, Levites, worship leaders. He stood in the middle of the courtyard and said, "It wasn't swords that saved us. It wasn't numbers. It was God." He looked each of them in the eyes. "So go, not with scrolls to judge, but with the word to remind." And they did. They spread through every village, town, and gate, not preaching fear, but reminding people of the faithfulness of God, of the valley, of the song, of the battle no one had to fight. Little by little, the people returned, not because they were forced, but because they remembered. One evening, Jehoshaphat sat alone on the same rooftop where he once prayed, "Lord, what do I do?" Now he looked out at a people singing again, not loud, not perfect, but real, and he smiled. Because sometimes the biggest miracle isn't in the storm God stops. It's in the hearts he softens over time. The first time Jehoshaphat felt the tremor, he was standing in the royal vineyard inspecting the vines. His hand shook. Just slightly? Not enough for others to see, but enough for him to know. Time was moving. The sun still rose. The people still sang. But Jehoshaphat's bones ached more. His breath shortened on long walks. His eyes, once sharp in battle, blurred at nightfall. And the question he'd avoided for years finally caught up with him. What happens when I'm gone? He called for his son, Jehoram. Strong, capable, brave, but proud. The kind of man who knew how to command troops but didn't always listen to wise voices. Jehoshaphat met him in the upper chamber of the palace. No throne, no crowd, just 2 generations, face to face. Jehoram bowed, stiff and formal. "You sent for me, father?" Jehoshaphat smiled faintly. "Yes, sit." The prince did, hands folded, eyes watching carefully. Jehoshaphat pulled the crown from his head and set it between them. "Do you know what this is?" Jehoram blinked. "It's the crown." Jehoshaphat shook his head. "It's the heaviest object in the kingdom." Jehoram didn't laugh, so the king continued. "When I first wore it, I thought it meant power, authority, strength." He leaned forward. "But the truth is, this crown is made of trust from the people and from God." Jehoram said nothing. Jehoshaphat took a deep breath. "You may wear it one day, but hear me clearly. Do not mistake control for leadership. You can force loyalty for a moment, but only faithfulness will last." Jehoram stared at the crown, unsure. Later that week, Jehoshaphat visited the temple, not for a ceremony, just to sit. He knelt by the altar, no robes, no guards, and he whispered, "Lord, if he forgets what you've done, remind him. If he runs from truth, stop him. And if he ever thinks he's enough without you, shake the throne beneath his feet." He looked up at the holy place he'd loved his whole life and sighed. He didn't want to live forever, but he wanted the people to remember forever who their true king was. That night the stars shimmered above Jerusalem, and inside the palace, the crown sat quietly on a velvet cloth. Not just waiting for a head, but waiting for a heart that knew how to carry it. The letter came on a day without clouds, carried by a fine horse wrapped in violet cloth sealed with the crest of the northern kingdom. Again, Jehoshaphat's steward handed it to him carefully. The old king sat beneath a fig tree in the garden, crown resting beside him, eyes heavy from a restless night. He read the scroll once, then again. A new northern king had risen, Jehoram, son of Ahaziah. A young man hungry for alliances, hungry for war, hungry for something impressive to put on his name. "Let us build together," the scroll said. "Join me in restoring the power of our fathers. Let the name of Judah rise beside Israel once more." Jehoshaphat folded the letter slowly. His hand trembled, not with age, but with anger. Not loud, just quiet, settled. He had seen too much to fall for charm. He had survived too many traps to mistake flattery for favor. But this time, the pressure was different. This wasn't about treasure. This was about legacy. People around him whispered, "End strong, my king. Leave your son a strong alliance. Show the world that Judah stands tall." It all sounded noble, but Jehoshaphat had learned something precious in the valley long ago. A victory outside God's will is just a decorated failure. He stood from the bench, scroll in hand, and walked slowly through the garden. He didn't rush. He didn't second guess. When he reached the fire pit, he dropped the scroll into the flames. The wax hissed. The parchment curled. And Jehoshaphat whispered, "Not this time." That evening, he stood on the palace balcony one more time, watching the moonlight spill over the quiet streets. He placed the crown gently in its wooden case and said aloud, though no one else was there to hear, "You are not my greatest gift to Judah. Obedience is, and that will echo longer than gold." The olive trees in the courtyard had grown taller. Children now played where guards once stood. The temple still shone in the sunlight, and the city walls stood firm. Years had passed. Jehoshaphat had ruled through war, through peace, through mistakes and mercy. His crown had grown heavier, not because of battles, but because of the lessons it carried. Now the king moved slower. He rose later, sat longer. But his voice, it was still steady. One morning, as the wind passed through the open windows of the throne room, Jehoshaphat asked his servant to bring him the old scrolls, records of the early days, reports of the 3 armies that once marched toward Judah, the fast, the prayer, the prophecy, the singing, the empty battlefield. He ran his fingers across the faded ink, eyes wet with memory. "That was the day I really became king," he whispered. "Not the day he was crowned, not the day he won a war, but the day he admitted, 'We don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you.'" Later that week, he called for the scribes. They came with tablets and ink. "I want this written down," Jehoshaphat said. "Not about my battles, not about my victories." They waited. He looked out the window. "Write that I failed. Write that I feared. Write that I almost followed the wrong path. But then write this: I returned. Again and again, I returned." In his final days, Jehoshaphat spent hours walking the temple halls. He prayed over the people. He blessed the priests. He knelt in silence, not asking for more days, but giving thanks for the ones he'd been given. One evening, his son Jehoram came to him in private. They sat on a balcony as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Jehoram was older now, rough around the edges, still learning. Jehoshaphat handed him a scroll. "What is this?" Jehoram asked. Jehoshaphat smiled softly. "Everything I wish I'd known when I was your age." Jehoram opened it. Inside were just a few lines, handwritten in a shaky script. "You will lead with mistakes. You will lead with scars. But if you lead with God, you will lead well." And then he rested, peacefully, quietly, the same way he led in the end. No thunder, no fanfare. Just a heart that had walked with God through valleys and blessings and made it to the finish line. Jehoshaphat was buried with honor, not because he built the biggest walls, not because he had the richest treasury, but because he was a king who kept coming back. Back to truth, back to worship, back to God. He didn't lead perfectly, but he finished faithfully. And heaven remembers those who return.